discussion. Who has a question, a clarification question, or a more substantive question for any of the panelists? Yes. Maybe say your name and then...
I'm Gilbert. I have two questions, one at a time, I guess. First, what is, for Dr. Amini, primarily, what was the evidence that Saudi Arabia wants an attack on Iran, and why they feel it's in their interest, and why does Turkey, even though you, as you say, they're trying for hegemony in the area, not want an attack on Iran?
Can you give us a reminder?
So the question is specifically about the evidence or the trend that is happening. One thing actually you should bear in mind is the sort of national rivalries is there, and that's really a serious issue. And with the actually sort of the great foray that Saudi Arabia had in the late 70s in providing actually environment for the Mujahideen actually to grow in order to defeat the Soviet Union and then push them out. That I think may be the beginning of a sort of a regional desire on the part of the Saudis. It may go actually earlier, but I think that was really the beginning of the Saudis exerting their actually sort of intense interest in becoming a regional power, if not more than that. So it goes back, and then as I mentioned, that was really one of the greatest social engineering disasters that were created under the tutelage. And remember, these Mujahideens, although managed to defeat Soviet Union, but they actually turned into a problem in their own, and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all these splinter groups actually they grew out of it. But again, remember when the revolution happened in Iran, at least initially actually there was this idea that you may have actually a democratic society that may show for the first time in that region that look, it is possible within the constraint of those cultures you can have a democratic actually environment, hence people can become full sort of citizens in their running. And from the very beginning, actually, Saudis were very much actually antithetical to that, sort of to what was happening in Iran. They were concerned about actually whether the same thing may happen in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, it did. There were actually some Shi'i sort of groups trying to rebel against the Saudis in the sort of early 80s, if I remember correctly, and there was a huge massacre in Mecca itself, actually, these people tried to take refuge there. So the problems, as you can see, build up, and then Saudi Arabia was very much behind in the sense of providing the financial support in the sort of war between Iraq and actually and Iraq, Iran and Iraq, and that actually is really the beginning of it. There is a religious element because of the very strict interpretation of Islam that they have, and for them actually Shiis are strictly not really even Muslims. There is these also elements there. But recently, they have been very forceful in trying to make sure that their influence does really actually extend beyond the financial sort of ability. Again, in the case of Syria, the French diplomats and the French government is really actually very unhappy with the way that Saudis are providing arms actually to the Syrian resistance groups. And it's really becoming a serious issue. And what is very interesting is that Western countries are really pulling back. The experience of Libya has taught them that things are not going to go as well as they were, as planned as they expected. Look at actually Libya again in this case. Basically, there is a full civil war happening. About a week ago, there was actually a conflict in the south of the country. 170 people actually died. In Tripoli itself, actually, the sort of nominal capital, so to speak, you have 50 different groups actually running the capital, and basically there is no government. We don't really hear much about it, but these are the consequences that people are really getting conscious about. If you allow the running of the guns and all these ammunitions, then a civil war actually may erupt. But going back actually what I'm sort of trying to get at. The Saudis is basically are very much interested in the leadership of the Islamic world, and that's a serious actually ambition for them, and they spend money and they spend resources as much as actually they can. And look, recently, the best example, look at actually how they have been suppressing the sort of the Arab Spring happening in Bahrain. Basically, a small minority governing over a majority that doesn't actually have any powers whatsoever, but the Saudis were at the forefront of being sort of the oppressive force there. And in fact, in the past 2 weeks, the Saudis have been trying with all sorts of very interesting ways of annexing Bahrain actually to Saudi Arabia. That you may actually have heard that Bahrainis are really complaining that it's only friendship, no more than that. Even if you are here for us to sort of suppress the opposition, still you are two separate countries. So in that respect, again, when the Syrian situation came up, it was Saudi actually publicly, this wasn't actually a private conversation, publicly announced that they are going to provide money for ammunition and guns and the rest for the Syrian actually resistance groups. So it seems as if this is the track record of what Saudi Arabia is following to exert its hegemony over the Middle East at least. I don't know whether I've actually responded to a question or have I, like a philosopher, successfully prevaricated.
Yes, you were hands up.
Hi, I'm Mary Crutchfield, and my question is for David Swanson. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed after hearing all of this. And my question for you is, what do you recommend for a good news source? And how can you trust the news source?
The question is, what is a good news source, and how do you know whether to trust a news source? I would say that if you go to, I mean, there's not any news source that doesn't sometimes have useful material in it, including the Washington Post, which I've maligned heavily. You can find good things in there once in a while. But I think you have to look at the track record of news sources. You have to look at, I mean, were it not for the New York Times and the Washington Post, there would not have been a war in Iraq in 2003. And there were many good outlets, independent radio shows like Democracy Now!, independent websites with significantly higher standards of journalism by the most traditional definitions than the New York Times or the Washington Post that had it right, that were right prior to going into Iraq. And if you read news skeptically and not just based on which news sources have the best record, you look for specific facts and documentable claims, and in terms of reading online, links to original sources that can be verified by multiple news sources, rather than vague notions of what's threatened and what's needed to counter it. And when you read something like the New York Times, they don't just have the facts wrong, right? It's not just that war is not the answer. They've asked all the wrong questions to begin with. And so the topic that you should be trying to read about is not there. So we're trying to find out whether Iraq has weapons or doesn't have weapons. But that question is as much a lie as either answer, because having weapons is not a justification to bomb a country. We have more weapons than anybody else. We do not think anyone is justified in bombing us. And so tried in writing a book called War is a Lie to look at all the lies that show up again and again for every war, like zombies that won't go away, so that when you see these discussions, you understand that it's not just that they're twisting the facts and hiding who's a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and using anonymous sources in order to slightly twist the spin, but they're having the wrong conversation to begin with, and you know it's lies without waiting decades for the Freedom of Information Act requests to come through. You know it's lies from the start. So go to good websites. Go to Common Dreams. Go to Truth Out. Go to my website warisacrime.org and look at the links to all the other journalists and websites that are producing good information.
Thank you very much.
The Peace Center has a list out on the literature table of good websites. It's at least a starter list that we've consulted, and also includes some suggested actions as well. So everyone help yourself to that. Phil.
Hi, Phil Plato with Defenders, and our newspaper, the headline Stop War in Iran. I wanted to mention in terms of the P5+1 talks, that's the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany, which got included because, well, it's Germany. And they're having these talks with Iran now. And as David pointed out, Iran has made a significant concession, offering to allow the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, the UN watchdog on nuclear issues, to commit to Iran and examine the military base where the IAEA says it suspects nuclear work is being done. As David pointed out, it's not part of the NPT. Iran is under no obligation to open up its military base, but is willing to do that. That's a significant concession. The P5+1, on the other hand, led by the United States, is demanding that Iran end its enrichment of uranium at 20% level, which is necessary to create the fuel for the Tehran nuclear reactor, which produces medical isotopes for 180,000 cancer patients throughout Iran, and ship its present 20% enriched uranium out of the country. In return, Iran will get nothing, and the U.S. and the European Union will continue to increase their sanctions against Iran, trying to strangle the country. So it looks like a setup. And I suspect what's going to happen is that these negotiations will go on just long enough to get us past the U.S. presidential elections, so that Obama will not be under pressure to do one thing or the other, which he doesn't like to do. And then after that, we'll face a much different situation. It's going through all the checklists that you have to do before you can actually go to war. The other thing I just wanted to mention was, in terms of the second speaker, the impression that you gave of the Islamic Republic of Iran, unfortunately, seemed to equate it with the Shah's regime. You said they were both brutal regimes, and unfortunately your family has suffered under both. I think it's very important to remember that while there are much progress that needs to be made internally in Iran, particularly with the judiciary, that the economic situation of the vast majority of Iranians has been increased tremendously since the revolution. It's, according to the World Bank, poverty is 1/8 of what it was under the Shah. And the benefits have accrued mainly to the poor and the working classes, which is why they are the social and political base for the government, as opposed to the Green Movement, which is a middle class and upper middle class movement. Also, when you mention the reasons for the tensions between the U.S. and Iran, you mentioned the profit motive of the armed merchants, you mentioned Saudi Arabia and Israel and Turkey. You did not mention the United States. And you particularly did not mention the fact that Iran has the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world, is the 2nd largest oil producer, and is defying the United States' attempts to achieve hegemony in the Middle East. The United States is the reason for the tension between Iran and between the U.S. and Iran. The onus is on the United States almost entirely. And I'm really sorry that you gave that impression. Perhaps you have your own political view on the internal views of Iran, but it's not good to give any validity to the right-wing propaganda that's coming out from this government as to who is really at fault in this situation.
Comment on this timing in that it appears to many people that if Israel is sufficiently satisfied with the Obama administration, it will not attack Iran until after the U.S. elections. Whereas if Israel does not think the negotiations are sufficiently to its liking, Israel will attack Iran before the U.S. elections because that is what Obama does not want. He wants it to come after the U.S. elections. It should be understood by the people of the United States, as it is well understood outside of the United States, that there are levers available for controlling Israel. Israel is not our government. It does not control the United States. On the contrary, if the United States chose to stop giving billions of dollars for weapons to Israel each year, that would be a tremendous bargaining chip. If the United States chose to stop promising to veto every offense by Israel, to veto every measure of accountability at the United Nations for abuses and crimes by Israel, that would be a huge bargaining chip. And if the United States refused to provide actual military assistance to Israel, not before an attack, as part of an attack, and inevitably as the result, because Iran will retaliate against U.S. troops, regardless of what is said publicly in Washington or Israel. So we should not allow the story to be sold to us, if in fact it goes down this way, that our government or our president didn't want this, and Israel couldn't be controlled. Israel could be controlled.
Against Eric Cantor for the 7th District, and I have my petition, which I'll be happy to have you all sign. I'll try to put it around. To segue on David's point, Ray McGovern, a former CIA senior analyst, has clarified this myth of Israel being an ally of the U.S. We hear that a lot from many politicians from both the Republican and Democratic parties. And although Israel does not have any formal treaty with the U.S., Eric Cantor just weeks ago has introduced a House resolution or a bill which passed by an overwhelming majority, which could easily be interpreted as a treaty of alliance with Israel. And so I just wanted to ask any of the panelists if they had any comments about that.
I don't know quite how to briefly answer that. It's actually a lot more complicated than it may seem. The leading, well, I know that during the recent budget crisis about a year and a half ago, it was Cantor himself who proposed that the foreign aid budget to Israel directly be separated and a special budget line be created for that, separate from the general foreign assistance budget line, so that if under the Boehner-Cantor threat to shut down the government, if all the budget lines were shut down, the special Israel line would remain open. And even some of the strong Zionist lobbies in Washington were actually discouraging Cantor. They said this is going to make Israel look like a special case, as if it isn't. And he actually backed off from that. So our representative is actually a sort of a leader in this direction. My current research project is looking at the first ever rise in pro-Palestinian sentiment starting in the 60s with the Black Power movement, Malcolm X and others. And one result of that has been the rise among Israeli supporters, which pro and anti-anything really are useless terms. you know, you're anti-American. What does that mean? I am an American. But, you know, so whatever we define pro-American, pro-Israeli, but pro-Israeli forces began shifting their strategies as a result of that by the early 70s to stress not just supporting Israel as an embattled Western democracy or as a homeland for Holocaust survivors, but as a strategic asset to the United States. And there's been a fairly raging battle ever since, often inside, about whether that's really true. The leading Israeli researcher of nuclear matters has essentially concluded that in 1973, that in a private walk on the White House lawn, that Prime Minister Golda Meir essentially threatened President Nixon. The idea being, if you don't supply us with conventional weapons to stop the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, we have the bomb in the basement and we'll do it ourselves. So ironically, the idea being that in essence, we can't not do what they want, because then they might do it their own way. So I mean, the dynamics of this question of an unspoken alliance with Israel are very profound. And I unfortunately really couldn't begin to fully answer your question other than to say there's an awful lot that isn't discussed. I mean, it's essentially one of the first things a new president learns from his successor since Nixon is the Israeli bomb in the basement story. And every president learns it. Helen Thomas tried to ask Obama when he was first elected.
In his first press conference.
Right, and he dodged it, because it's one of the first things each new man, or maybe eventually a woman, will learn, is that we've got this problem. And here it is. So we hear about the Zionist lobby and the power, and I'm not dismissing that, but there are some far more fundamental things at stake there. And I don't just mean Israeli use of nuclear weapons against Islamic enemies. I mean, the main thing that the American spy Pollard was supplying the Israelis with was targeting information about Russian missile silos. The United States has long had a concern about Israeli nukes being used against other people besides Middle Eastern enemies. So it's a very profound issue, and I really couldn't get into it, unfortunately, in a short amount of time.
For Dr. Amini, the context of my question is what I know about the Cuban immigrant influence on American foreign policy towards Cuba, and the Iraqi immigrant community and their influence in the war with when we attacked Iraq. Could you give me some comments on what the Westwood community out in California and other places, are they having any influence on American foreign policy towards Iran at this time?
It's very interesting that you raise this issue, actually. In comparison to Cuba, actually, no. Basically, the Iranian opposition is very fragmented, extremely fragmented, and you do not see actually sort of a power base for the opposition outside Iran trying to influence Western powers. You do have groups here or there, but my sort of perception of the situation is that basically, no, Iranian opposition is really on the fringes, given the fact that actually it's extremely fragmented. So when you think about the Cubans and their sort of lobbying sort of potency, no, there isn't actually any such potency. Or thinking of the Iraqis, actually, that at some point, like Ahmad Chalabi managed actually to influence policies. So far as I know, actually, no, there isn't. And some people who are very close to President Obama's administration, interestingly enough, these people actually are very much, to put it mildly, in cahoot with the regime in Iran because they are gaining benefits. So that's the irony of it. People who are actually close to President Obama when it comes to issues about Iran, these are the people who have at least financial actually engagement and involvement with the regime in Iran. So you feel as if, okay, what is happening here? So far as I can gather from the general sort of understanding of the opposition outside Iran, no, I don't actually see any group having any specific influence whatsoever. You do have splinter groups, but these are really in the minority and not having much actually sort of, they cannot sway much actually opinion in any of the administrations in Western countries.
And that is that, you know, we sit here and there's probably not one of us that feels that our government is representing how we feel about this issue. And surely the people in Iran, there must be so many that feel that their government isn't representing them. Is there any way of having people talk to people? Kathy, he's got me. I'll be there to say something.
Very interesting actually observation, but let me remind you, I'm a philosopher, not very good with practical issues, so I will be really the last person. To be honest, at this moment I can't really see anything specific that we can do in the sense of making a wave of human sort of action so that we can bring the two sort of nations or the two sort of populations together. But it's very interesting is that the Iranians are very sensitive. I mean, it's not as if, although the media is being, the internal media is being actually controlled heavily, and basically, if you step off the line, the consequences are very drastic. Despite actually the gentleman's comments, a lot of my own friends, for just writing an article, one actually particular person that I have in mind, he is one of the sort of best intellectuals in Iran within the sort of political community, Zaid Abadi. The man just actually did not mention sort of an epitaph that usually used in relation to Khamenei. And this poor man was tortured and he's in prison for the past 6 years. So it's not as if actually things are not really that bad. So internally, there isn't really much channel of sort of providing information. But the population itself, no, they are not limited actually to what the regime actually provides. They do have access to satellite dish and other means actually. Although internet is being heavily actually filtered and extremely sort of under supervision and control, but nonetheless actually the new population is really actually reaching out, getting a lot of information. But what is happening in Iran actually, it's a very interesting phenomenon. That's why actually when the gentleman mentioned about what's happening, the situation is far more complex. Let me just give an insight about what is happening. Since 1850s, Iran has been actually facing for the past 150 years with 3 different cultures, and that actually has produced a lot of actually issues and problems in the sense of what it is to be an Iranian. The 3 cultures are the ancient sort of Persian culture, going back to about 2,500 years minimum. And then the religious Islamic culture going back to about 1,400 years. So these 2 sort of cultures constantly were in competition with one another. Since the middle of the 19th century, a 3rd element was introduced, the culture of modernity, as Dr. actually Fishbach rightly pointed out. That culture of modernity has really had a huge impact on the Iranian psyche. As a result, actually, you do not see a clear coordination of these 3 cultures together. That's why the gentleman is right, actually. Statistics speaking, about 10 to 15 million in Iran are still actually supporting the government, the regime, no actually doubt about it. If you take the population, 75 million, 15 million definitely are there. When Ahmadinejad actually claims that he actually had 20 million, actually he did really have 14 million votes in the last election. But actually the opponent had more, so to speak. But nonetheless, there is this thing happening in the Iranian psyche that you have these 3 cultures that are not coordinating with one another. And that has been actually a source of weakness and a lot of issues. And the regime actually cleverly tries to exploit it. During the regime of Shah, 2 cultures were at the top. The modernity plus the nationalistic and religious culture was being pushed on. Hence the revolt later on. Post the revolution, you have the other 2. First, actually, the religious culture. Secondly, the Iranian culture to a lesser extent, but definitely modernity, the culture of modernity is being pushed back. So there is constant, actually, conflict inside the Iranian psyche. I'm not just talking about anybody in the regime, just the public actually does really have this serious problem. And what is very interesting about Iran that is happening, especially in the past 15 years, it's on the verge of actually a moral and value implosion. The society is changing drastically to the point that Iranians themselves are not capable of handling day-to-day affairs. Part of the reason is that the government actually has been so corrupt and encouraging actually hypocrisy that the culture is becoming thoroughly hypocritical. These issues are very small, but when you look at it from the social pathology, it does really have an impact on what is happening. My last comment actually on this issue is that when you look at 3 years ago when Ahmadinejad came into re-elected by the votes being rigged, 5 million people came out. The gentleman was right, predominantly these 5 million were actually middle class to a large extent. But here is the issue. These very 5 million actually sort of pushed themselves back, so to speak. There came a point of confrontation, and this is what is very interesting about Iran. They could have pushed actually the edge, but they didn't. The reason is that they have realized that violence is not going to get anywhere. If anything, it's going to create more problems. Hence, you don't really see that fierceful opposition in the population because they think that it may go in the wrong direction. There is one sort of general analysis of the revolution that happened in Iran, and it was basically Iran had a revolution without a theory, and that was absolutely right. The revolution happened, and the people in charge had no understanding of what they were supposed to do. People have come to realize this, and hence they are very, very cautious on how to react against the regime. Hence, they get the news, they get actually the information to some extent, but they are very reluctant to act on it because they are not quite sure whether the consequences justify or not.
If I could just add briefly to that, a few weeks ago, some people in Israel began posting their photos on the internet with a standard graphic beneath that said, "We love Iran, we will never bomb you." And you hear a lot of times this idea of something spreading virally on the internet, but this actually did. And people around the world began filling these websites with these photos of themselves with very similar messages, including from Iran, responding with, yes, limited internet, but clearly not absolutely cut off internet, because this is an exchange that is ongoing between people in the nations that are threatening Iran and people within Iran, outside of the control of our governments, which love to hate each other so much. And so I would strongly encourage these kinds of online action, as well as any other educational action, any spreading of the movies, including award-winning, powerful, professionally made, movies that come out of Iran, and films and documentaries and photos and stories from Iranian Americans and their families that can humanize Iran for the rest of us, that can increase this understanding that when we talk about what Iran is doing in the news, we're not talking about 70 million people. We're talking about a government, just as when we talk about what the United States is doing. And I think we also have to remember constantly how to have an understanding of what it means to say that, this percentage of people support the government, right? Because, as opposed to what? Right? If someone asked me, do you support your government in Washington, D.C., as opposed to a government that took the money out of the system and represented me and ended this military madness and taxed billionaires and funded green energy, you know which one I'm going to choose. But if somebody asked me, do you support your government or the Chinese government that wants to militarily invade the United States and take it over, you know which one I'm going to choose. And so if you want to build support within Iran for the most nationalistic, the most right-wing tendencies, well, you threaten to bomb it. That's what you do. And I think we also have to constantly remind each other that when we talk about the shortcomings of a foreign government, we should not only look in the mirror, but we should look at the incredible shortcomings of every single government we've ever built when we went around the world nation building. Not only is Libya a disaster, but Afghanistan doesn't even pretend to hold legitimate elections, as after a decade, right? What people have done non-violently in Egypt, in Tunisia, beginning in Bahrain, beginning and now possibly ruined in Syria, so much more powerful, so much more effective than what we've done in the past decade with our efforts to better other people's nations for them, whether they wanted it or not. And this is what scared Saudi Arabia. The power of people going up against dictatorship. This is what scared Washington. Right? This is why the Arab Spring had to be militarized and diverted, and so you have to think twice about everything you hear when you drive home and listen to NPR.
I'm just going to add a bit to what David just said, and we're running out of time. But just sort of in response to all of this that we've been talking about, in response to the stories that Dr. Amini has shared about his experiences in Iran, his observations about Iran, in response to some discussion about the Green Movement, which was the human rights movement that arose in 2009 in Iran, based mostly in the cities, and it was a more college-educated movement, whereas the Ahmadinejad government has more support among the rural and the poorer people. But I think it's I think a struggle that happens within the peace movement. And I sometimes struggle myself to find the language where we as human beings, of course, have compassion with any other human being that is experiencing any form of domination under any sort of regime. And we feel that sort of empathy and that compassion for other people elsewhere, even as we understand that we in our own country have such a compromised democratic system, and we have so much work to be doing here on our own governmental systems. But I think it's also just very important as a peace center, as a peace movement, to be cognizant of the history of U.S. relations to the Middle East, and that even as we have that impulse and that human sort of sympathy, to just be very careful that we need to really respect the Iranian people and their process, and that to the extent that we, or at least to the extent that our government, that the state, gets involved, that it then distorts that dynamic, and that it in many ways can undermine space for democratic movements in other countries. And just as David and just as everyone has said, can actually very much reinforce the things that the dynamics of oppression that we say that we want to challenge. And so I think there's this kind of benevolent impulse sometimes among people who are concerned with peace, that we're concerned about other people's oppression, therefore we need to intervene, we need to do something. I even heard that in the lead up to the Iraq War, which clearly in retrospect was a terrible disaster. Many of us anticipated that it would be. But oh no, Saddam Hussein is oppressing his people. We need to do something. And I think we really, as Americans, need to relearn that lesson and to really stop and be just extremely, extremely careful about sort of that slippery slope of having a sense of human sympathy for another people and letting that sort of bleed into support for a foreign intervention that is a military intervention. One last question. Rain, I see your hand up.
I wanted to know from David whether the Roots Action group that you help coordinate, is that group linked on your warsacrime.org? Or can you tell people about that? It's a way for all these people to be active if they've not heard of it.
You'll get the check tomorrow. Rootsaction.org is a website that I work for that was created to do online activist organizing and pressure for peace and justice, even when the Democrats are in power. So it's sort of moveon.org with a twist. Regardless of where it's linked from, if you want to check it out, you just type in rootsaction.org. Thanks, Rain. Two last points in closing. One point is, I think we learned in the lead up to the Iraq War, and while the Iran situation is unique, and I'm not saying it's an exact analogy here, I think we have to learn some lessons from our recent experiences with war. I think one thing that we learned in the lead up to the Iraq War is that the American public actually was very skeptical of the Iraq War in the year or so leading up to it. And our government basically unveiled a very intense marketing and propaganda campaign that it implemented through the mass media with a lot of deception. And I just think we all need to be conscious. My hope is that these peace negotiations work. I think we all hope that war can be avoided, but I think we do need to be vigilant, and to be vigilant including after the US elections, and just be alert to incidents that appear surprising. There's an excellent movie called War Made Easy by Norman Solomon that I recommend very, very much. But just be skeptical about sudden surprise. You know, it's possible that another country could provoke Iran to do something as a provocation for war. And many of our recent, starting with Vietnam and, you know, pretty much every one of our major wars we've been involved with, and there's been something like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or the weapons of mass destruction talk before Iraq. President Bush talked in his State of the Union address about Iraq having accessed
uranium from Niger, from an African country. It all turned out to be based on false documents. So again, just let's try to be skeptical and think critically, look for alternative sources of information. There's a wonderful list on our action handout out on the literature table. The other thing I want to mention is that in the event that a military strike does take place, the Richmond Peace Education Center does call on everyone to gather on the federal courthouse steps. That's on 7th and Broad downtown. And we're calling this jointly with the Richmond Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. And we invite other organizations, churches, faith groups to join us in this call for a nonviolent but very visible and powerful show of opposition should in fact a military strike occur by Israel, by the United States, or by another Western power on Iran at any time in the next year. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us tonight. We really appreciate it. Please stay in touch, and let's all work to build a more peaceful world. Thank you.